beyond dilemma. A few quick housekeeping matters before we get started. We are recording today's conversation and plan to share it with you following today's session. Throughout the conversation, we absolutely welcome your engagement. Please use the chat box as you're seeing on your screen today, at the bottom of your screen, where we will allow time near the end of today's session to address any questions you may have that come up through today's discussion. And as with many of you, we are working from our home offices, so you may hear some background noise. We appreciate your understanding. To get us started, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Nancy.
Okay. Hi, Param. Thank you very much for having me on this session. So my name is Nancy Mehrad. I'm the founder and CEO of Registrant Law. And I've had the pleasure of working with numerous clients over the past, I guess, couple of years now that the client-focused reforms has been in effect, and enjoyed tackling and all the challenges that have come to us so far and continue to be present. So I do look forward to speaking about the client-focused reforms today, and look forward to hearing from my co-panelists as well.
Thank you, Nancy. JP?
Hi, everyone. Hey, Param. It's good to see you all. My name is Justitia Pak. I am an implementation consultant. I recently was working for and supporting the CFR implementation at one of the big 5 Canadian banks here in Toronto, and specifically building out, designing, and delivering the KYP program.
Thank you, Justitia. Mr. Rizi?
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. I'm Rich Rizi. I'm Senior Director of Investment Services for Worldsource. In that capacity, I handle both product shelves for both our IROC dealer and our MFDA dealer. Looking at this picture on your screen, I don't seem to be able to take a good picture to save my life. But thank you for having me nonetheless.
Awesome.
Thank you, Richard. Go ahead, Dave.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dave Carprice. I look after product and marketing here at InvestorCOM. Have really spent the last, probably about 3 years focusing on our KYP solutions and client-focused reform. So I've probably spoken with many of you on the call today, either through webinars like today's or directly through some of our client calls.
Thank you, Dave. And my name is Param Nasseri. I wear the regulatory strategy hat at InvestorCOM, and I will be moderating today's conversation. Speaking of which, over the CFR journey, we brought the wealth management and compliance community together to discuss various approaches to implementing the client-focused reforms. In this light, we conducted a pre-webinar poll and compared your responses to similar questions we asked earlier on during the CFR journey. So here's what we found. Our first question asked about the level of implementation progress you've had. And as you can see, responses indicate that some progress is being made, which is certainly positive, with some making progress and addressing technology pain points. On the flip side, there does appear to be still some folks that appear to be continuing to work on the CFR project, which is certainly why there's such a big turnout here today. Secondly, we asked which segment of the client-focused reforms is most challenging to implement. And as you guessed, the advisor-specific KYP and assessment of alternatives received the highest votes. Interestingly, it's even more challenging. It appears to be more challenging now for the respondents post the CFR deadline than when we conducted this poll back in May of 2021. Continuing on, we asked about specific elements of the KYP obligations as it adheres to the dealer obligation, and how would you plan to monitor significant change on your product shelf? And as you can see, the specific use of technology has been ramping up throughout the industry. Then we asked about the dealer's obligations when it comes to assessing the competitive nature of product shelves in a post-CFR world. And as you can see, certainly the degree of importance on that particular element appears to be ramping up in a post-CFR world. Finally, we asked about the role of digitizing record keeping in a post-CFR regime, specifically around KYP and this analysis of reasonable alternatives. And as you can see, nearly 90% believe this to be a very important layer of implementing the client-focused reforms. Having said that, we really appreciate your participation on these polls. As I mentioned off the top, we'll share these data points with you following today's session. We do hope that you find insight in seeing how you and your peers are tackling the specific elements of the client-focused reforms. Let's move forward to our agenda. In today's webinar, we're going to discuss taking a strategic approach to implementing KYP. We'll talk about challenges faced by taking a manual approach to the KYP requirements, and then what you can expect come regulatory examination front with respect to the client-focused reforms. As I mentioned off the top, please use the chat box to engage us and ask questions throughout today's conversation. We have a lot of time near the end of today's presentation to address any questions that may come up. Let's jump right in. Nancy, let's zoom in on the specific elements of the client-focused reforms. And as you said off the top, with the CFR implementation deadline behind us, I'm sure you have some insights. What are you hearing in the industry with respect to compliance?
Sure. Thanks, Param. And thanks to InvestorCOM for putting together a session like this, as I think it is quite important and necessary for the industry, at least for the next little while, to keep talking to each other about the different approaches that we're each taking on the CFRs, as it is a principles-based set of rules. So it's important to keep comparing notes and to make sure that you're not the outlier in your interpretation of the rules. But I think, based on my conversation with clients, which vary from, small, medium to large size portfolio managers, as well as, IROC or MFDA dealers, I think most firms have made a good faith effort by now to comply with the CFRs. I think, they've each taken different approaches, of course, on how to tackle the CFRs because of their different business models or the types of products that they offer. And if you were to ask me, before the end of the year, I think firms then were really concentrating on building out their processes and making sure that they met the December 31st deadline. And, lots of anxious calls before then. But I think by now, most firms have implemented their processes and they're pretty comfortable-ish with the decisions that they've made. But of course, now we're in implementation mode, right? So you're seeing a lot of calls. I'm getting a lot of calls about different implementation questions. You're getting a lot of people fine-tuning their processes, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work, and then making adjustments as necessary. So I think, you're going to see a lot of that over the next little while. But in terms of assessing whether their aggregate approach to the CFRs was on point, my sense is that the industry is really waiting to see what the future CSA guidance will say about whether what they've done is in fact in line with what the regulators were expecting. And until we hear back from the regulators, or until we get that guidance, I think we need to continue to have these sessions, fine-tune our processes, and just tag along, continue to progress our processes.
Nancy, thank you for sharing that. I certainly agree that it's going to have to be an iterative approach, and certainly conversations like today are a path in that direction. Richard, if I could ask you, as one of Canada's largest wealth management firms, can you touch on how you've tackled the CFR requirements specifically as they pertain to the KYP requirements?
Yeah, I can. Thanks for the question. I'll start by saying that we realized very quickly that the CFRs in aggregate probably represent the largest set of reforms to hit our industry in the last 20 years. As a result, we really didn't start looking at the reforms. We didn't start working on the reforms in 2021. We actually started working on them back in 2018, as your flow chart there indicates. And we did that when we first engaged the CSA through their request for comment process on 31103. And when we initially read that paper, we realized very quickly that the words in the instrument really mattered. For instance, there was one comment that, written in the paper that essentially read something like, unless an advisor has a reasonable basis for determining that a high cost security will be better for a client, their expectation was that the advisor trade the lowest cost security that is available to the client. So our comment back to that statement was the cost is not the only measure that needs to be looked at in the suitability or in the KYP determination process. And we know that advisors now only need to assess the cost of products as opposed to recommend the cheapest product alternative. So my point in mentioning this is that the consultation process, it actually does work. Regulators do listen, but industry participants need to participate in that consultation process, and they need to participate early, and they need to participate often every time the opportunity presents itself. So I'd say overall, our approach to the CFRs right out of the gate has been to work with regulators as well as advisors in order to advocate for them with regulators, as well as to educate advisors on how they can meet all of their CFR obligations, including with respect to KYP.
Rich, thank you for sharing that. It's certainly, I definitely commend you on your comment around the consultative approach taken by the regulators. Given where we started and where we've ended up, it's certainly been a journey. Let me ask you, Justitia, this particular question. You also led the successful implementation of the KYP requirements at one of Canada's largest banks. No small feat. Can you elaborate on that whole journey and maybe share a little bit about your experience?
Yeah, sure. I'll share some comments and then we can kind of take it naturally from there. As Richard and others have pointed out, CFR and specifically KYP, they're not exactly new concepts. KYC, KYP, they've been around for a while. But what I felt was really interesting with this implementation, with the recent deadlines that were introduced, was that it really kind of, I think, push things forward in terms of making sure that there were stronger processes, there was more transparency, there was better record keeping. So it was really an opportunity, I think, for a lot of financial institutions to kind of open the hood, so to speak, and look at a lot of things that are part of the process and to try to look at things a little bit more holistically. At least that's the approach that our implementation took. And one thing that was great was there's so many layers to this in terms of there's training, like Richard was talking about, there's policy and procedures, working with regulators, and of course training your advisors. But one thing that I was really encouraged and drawn to with our implementation was, if we looked at it like, how can we try to respect the current culture and the way people work, but try to really look at this as a digital or technology first initiative. We know that regulations are changing. CFR is not the last piece of legislation and regulation that's going to come in. The world is changing faster and bigger than it has in the past. So really trying to bake technology and digital change into your DNA as an organization, I think is going to be one of the key components you're going to see moving forward in the industry, and trying to find a more kind of marriage, almost, so to speak, between regulation and technology, I think is going to be at the forefront of the organizations that are going to be on the edge of this change and leading it. So it was really encouraging that our team was empowered to really look at a digital first technology and to try to take that as a centerpiece and organize a process around it. So, it was encouraging. It was something that we did that was slightly different. It was very expansive. And we know that a lot of organizations, there's a lot of touch points. There's a lot of people to consult. So starting really early and getting that clear and visible leadership support was really important. But I think that, having that digital first and really having that, especially because trying to do this manually, and I think we're going to get into this a little bit more, is becoming increasingly prohibitive from just a cost, from a resource, and even from a regulatory perspective. So this isn't just about saving money in people or just protecting yourself from making regulatory issues or mistakes, but this can also be something that launches you into more competitive strategic opportunities as well. So that's a little bit about our thinking and how we were approaching the KYP implementation.
Absolutely love it, JP. I knew you were going to draw upon your library of analogies, and that marriage between taking a strategic approach as well as aligning it with the direction of the regulations is super sound. Speaking of this, Dave, I know you mentioned this, that you've had the good fortune of speaking with a whole slew of firms, large and small, across the industry about these particular requirements. What are the things, a couple of things that actually stood out to you?
Yeah, and before the new year in fall, we actually had a webinar where I shared a lot about how firms were preparing for the deadline. And so today I'll focus a bit on since the deadline's come and gone. And based on the survey results, I'd say on one hand, it was a little surprising to see the number of firms that kind of still said it was still in process. But on the other hand, it wasn't really surprising. And to Nancy's earlier comment, achieving that passing grade by January 1st or a good faith effort really doesn't mean the end of the journey. And that kind of speaks to the interest in attending the webinar today. And so, since January 1st, what are some of the things I've been hearing from the clients we've talked to and are working with? First off, there's a lot of phasing happening, right? So there's, how do you do the best good faith effort for Jan 1? And then what are the different components of the solution that are rolling out, whether that's, adding different security types to the mix, integrating solutions into a back office, the number of phased elements that are challenging, and some are just delayed. You're right, the deadline dovetails with kind of the busy selling season. So minimizing disruption in the advisor's workplace also has played into the timing of some of that. There's a lot of workarounds and manual processes that I'm seeing, form filling and those kinds of things, finding information on your own, on manufacturers' websites or something like that. And the third thing I've noticed is there are some that are delegating some of this work, I'll say, in a principles-based way. What I mean by that is essentially saying, when they looked at CFR, unlike Richard, who said this is a significant change in our regulatory landscape, some firms have said it's really just essentially best practices when it comes to practice management, and it's just adding a bit more documentation around that. And so, in those areas, we're seeing, advisors being told to continue to do the right thing, only maybe increase the level of documentation. And actually that subjective, or I'll call it a principles-based push down to IAs and advisors, is generating a lot of interesting feedback. I'll kind of touch on a bit later in our conversation today.
So thanks for sharing that, Dave. So hearing kind of where we are and where we want to go, let's sort of zoom in on the dealers' KYP obligations a little bit more. And maybe Nancy, I'll start with you, and let's take a focused approach on the dealer's obligations, and specifically the requirement of assessing the product shelf, assessing the dealer's product shelf, excuse me. What are some practical steps that you've spoken to firms about around the wide-ranging implications of these requirements?
Sure, yeah, and I think I've said this before, not all firms are the same, right? And so firms have taken different approaches to how they conduct their assessment, and again, depending on their business model. Some firms have decided to delegate the product assessment onto registered individuals, which is, just in line with what Dave was saying as well, depending on, the type of products that their RIs typically have access to, while others have kept it more at the firm level, in particular, if it's a limited shelf that they offer. So I think, you're going to see a variety of different approaches. Some firms already had very sophisticated KYP assessment teams or departments, right? And so for them, there's not going to be a whole lot of change just because they were already, doing that KYP assessment. I think for them, it just might be more of record keeping or enhancing their policies and procedures that might have to change. But then, you saw some other firms, particularly, the ones that didn't have the same level of resources or the research teams. For them, they had to take different approaches. So, and that's fine. It just depends on the business model that they have. So it could have included things like, forms, questionnaires, and so that's where we had to help. I had to help a lot of my clients in that regard as well, just processes to make that assessment easier and consistent for the firm. And I think you have to also keep in mind, the regulators have given us a lot of flexibility in how we approach the CFRs, and the level of KYP assessment can vary, right? So products that are lower risk public securities are going to have a much lower due diligence requirement than, say, a private security or a more complex product. So, and that's all fine, provided that your products or your compliance manual set out the different levels of the assessment that's required. And again, the regulators have also mentioned that a security by security process will not always be required. So that flexibility, I think, gave firms the ability to take a different approach to how they conducted their KYP assessment, depending on their business models.
Thank you. Certainly, this term risk-based approach comes to mind when it comes to tackling the specific elements of the KYP requirements. And certainly this whole notion of IROC versus MFDA versus the PM channel, it has been a theme in the industry. I'm going to come to you on this, Rich, but before that, Dave, you've worked with a whole bunch of firms across the industry. Have you seen much of a difference between how firms are tackling this, whether they're sort of sitting on the IROC or MFDA channel?
Yeah, I'll highlight really two quick differences. One is kind of obvious. It's the security types that are being dealt with and monitored, where MFDA, the focus is really on ETFs and mutual funds, not in that mutual fund bucket. I'd throw in kind of liquid alts. Whereas the IROC dealers while they monitor those as well, they're adding some of the other security types to their watch list, like equities and fixed income. But to support what Nancy said, they're all, as you go to different security types, it's a different approach. It may not be a security by security. And so certainly that's one difference. And the other one is also, that trend of exposing, and this time I'll use the word delegating a little less, but exposing the advisors and IAs to that monitoring capability. So that becomes part of their KYP and product knowledge is watching for significant change. The one I'll quickly highlight, which isn't the difference between MFDA and IROC, and it supports what Nancy said on the assessing products that are, to make sure they're competitive, is a bit more of an emphasis on that assessment with firms that have proprietary products on their shelf. That one's kind of specifically called out, and the firms that are open and don't have proprietary products don't concern themselves as much about that.
Thanks, Dave. Mr. Rizi?
Yeah, there's been a few great comments made. Nancy made a comment right off the bat in that the industry is really waiting to hear what the CSA has on guidance with respect to KYP, with respect to both dealers and advisors' responsibilities. I'm not here to say that there's been a lack of it. I'm here to say that it's largely been open to interpretation, and dealers do have to take a risk-based approach. We are one of the firms that has had a very robust KYP process since I've been at Worldsource, and I've been at Worldsource for well over a decade. And I've always taken the approach that the products that we as a dealer or dealers make available for sale. From a reputational risk standpoint, the products that we approve is one of, if not the biggest risk that a dealer faces. The MFDA implemented KYP for dealers after the fallout of Portis. IROC waited a couple years, and it really came into force after they saw very low risk ratings on asset-backed commercial paper that were on dealers' product shelves. We have a very formalized KYP process. We've always honed in on structural risks that typically are more inherent on complex products such as exempt market and alternative products. By way of example, we hone in not just on the product's costs and advisor compensation. We look at and pay a lot of attention to liquidity. We even look at third-party providers such as the fund's trustee, who their custodian is, and who their audit team is. One of the things, if you remember, just shortly after the credit crisis, Bernie Madoff's fund blew up. One of the things that would have caught our attention through our due diligence process on that fund was the use of a two-person audit team to basically provide a little bit of oversight on a $50 billion fund structure. In our opinion, that two-person audit team doesn't have the capacity to provide audit services to a fund of that size and that complexity. That doesn't mean that a two-person audit team can't perform other functions, but that is one of the things that would have raised a red flag for us. From a CFR perspective, we also have really started to hone in on conflicts of interest that may be attached to the sale of a security or product, even when that product is one of our proprietary products. We always assess conflicts of interest, and I can tell you regulators are honing in on conflicts of interest with respect to the sale of products. I'd even argue that that's the first thing that they look at. So we need to be able to document that we've looked at and assessed conflicts of interest with respect to the sale of all the products that we offer, not just the ones that are proprietary. And one of the things that is essential to our DNA is really having a robust product shelf. We're on record as saying in the media that we believe that a client's having a robust product shelf really is in the client's best interest. As opposed to, I think the approach that some firms have taken, we're not looking at shrinking our product shelf. We're actually looking to expand it and making available different product types, such as ETFs on our MFDA dealers, such as alternative mutual funds, such as exempt market products. And the only way you can really do that is through the use of technology. I think we've all heard Dave say, and perhaps he's waiting to the end of this webinar to make his usual speech about, there's thousands of changes to mutual fund data points that occur every month. And he's absolutely right. The only way you can really track those changes is through technology, through the use of tools that aggregate that data and make it available for dealers as well as for advisors to review and assess whether those changes are impactful enough to warrant a change to your product shelf or even to a client's portfolio.
Richard, those were some of the wisest words I've heard along this CFR journey for sure, and certainly you quoted a colleague, so brownie points there. Justitia, you've also kind of taken a practical approach at tackling these dealers' KYP obligations, and also looked at deploying technology. Super curious about what your reflections are based on what Richard just shared, as well as sort of some approaches you've taken that were productive on your firm's end.
Yeah. Yeah, I really resonated with a lot of the thoughts that Richard, you just shared. You know, and I smiled a bit when you commented on, because, I've talked to Parm and Dave about this too. There is just so many changes. The days of trying to kind of go it alone or to do it yourself, those days may be coming to an end for a lot of different reasons. Technology is just a requirement. But then it also got me thinking, like, to what extent do we need to monitor the competitive universe along with our shelves? I think those are all questions that we're still waiting to see exactly what those answers are going to be. But in terms of our implementation, aside from what I shared earlier around making sure that there was a technology component that we thought could scale, because we knew that these issues are not going away. If anything, they're going to be becoming larger as new products and more diverse products start to enter the marketplace, including ones that are going to inherently carry more risk. We can get into that later if you want. So making sure you have that foundation to ensure that you have the digital capacity and the functionality to be able to scale and to absorb all that. So one of the things that we knew was important is, I spoke earlier about like respecting your culture. So we had a product committee that was made up of, it was cross-line, cross-business, that was made up of senior leaders that would go through and regularly review the product shelf. So what we did was ensure that we had a direct pipeline, a standing agenda item in that meeting every time they met every quarter, to ensure that we would be able to say, here's the assessment of the product shelf that we currently have. So to try to bring the digital into the human component of it. So that was something that we knew was going to be important. Like, we didn't want to be overly disruptive, because I'm sure all of us have experience with a lot of the larger financial institutions. Like, they have, a lot of different departments, a lot of different teams, and good change is one that's holistic, that works together, where everyone understands what's happening. So I just think that was, some of the key areas that we knew were important. Finding the right partners. One thing I was also kind of struck by was, it sometimes feels like, it's like one of those cooking shows, right? Like, you have to deliver your plate at the end and it will be judged. If you plan well, you can do something robust and interesting. If you don't, you will just end up throwing something on a plate and you'll get crushed when it gets reviewed. So to ensure that you have a longer lead time is important. But we all know that, of course, it's simple to say start early, assume surprises. These things we all know are wise words. But in the tyranny of the urgent day to day, often these things you just can't. So what I found was a great hedge, and one of the great strategy is partnering with third-party partners, because they allow you to really compress your time frame. So it was funny when you were looking, I was just taking some notes, and when you were going through those poll results at the beginning, a lot of people have started, and I was surprised when I saw that there were some people who still haven't started yet. And for those people who are under significant time constraints or time pressure, really finding a good partner is going to not just be ideal from a strategic perspective, but it may be your only option to try to bring something to production in a time frame that the regulators will find acceptable. So I think, again, finding the right partners, and Parm, I've talked about this, not just the ones with the technical features, functionalities, and all the digital stuff that you need, but also the ones that have been in the space and have some thought leadership, that understand what the regulations down the road are coming. Because as far as we can see to the horizon, we know that there are further changes coming, but also what's beyond the horizon that you can't see, to ensuring that you have a program and process that is agile by nature, because we know there's going to be changes coming. We know that the regulators are going to review things, and they're gonna, it's almost like this chess match that goes back and forth. And as that develops, your ability to adapt your infrastructure and your program in an agile capacity will not just be a key driver to reduce the pain of change when you have to make changes to meet new obligations, but that I really do believe is going to be a competitive advantage going further. The firms that are able to do it faster and better will not just incur less risk, but less cost and faster time to market. And I think those are all things that people would agree are benefits, especially if you can do them, because you have to meet these obligations anyways. So those are just some thoughts, Parm.
Thanks, JP. I gotta echo this back at you, because you were also a wonderful partner throughout this process. And really it is that sort of two-way street of learning about your practices and trying to figure out exactly how it is that our technology and our partnership can help on this front. You touched on a few things that were sort of more nuanced to the regulations, and I think given that we've got Dave here, he's probably the best person to speak to the materiality index, the power of the peer rating analytics that are proprietary to our solutions, specifically as it sort of speaks to this assessment of significant change. This is, I think, what Mr. Rizi was alluding to. Can you just touch on the value of those capabilities?
Yeah, thanks, Parm. And so I won't, thanks for doing the speech for me, Richard. There's a lot of change. And the challenge is really, how do you sift through it? And, you know, if we look at how firms are tackling it, and some of the principles we've tried to put into our shelf monitor solution is really identifying, you know, what are those data points that are significant? You can't monitor everything. And again, it's by product type. Mutual funds or other packaged products have just some great standard things that you can watch, like risk indicators or ratings, investment time horizon. You know, the MERs and SIFC categories get updated on a regular basis, and it's a really good ecosystem for good data. And there are few other data points to a lesser degree that are common we see with clients, like beta or Sharpe ratios, investment strategies, portfolio managers. But you shift security types. Now the indicators and data is a bit more continuous. It's loose. It's not well organized. So you're looking for other indicators like, you know, credit rating changes in yields or other ratios over a defined measurement period, and choosing a threshold at which that becomes significant. So challenge one is get all the change, and then challenge two is filter it down. And certainly, you know, I think the firms that started early started with, I want to know all the change, I want to see all the change. And round two of that is, which is really a best practice, is on the automation front, you really want to isolate the key indicators that you want to be alerted to on a regular basis. Otherwise, just a deluge of information. And it really does need to integrate with the rest of that process. And Richard, you talked about a great job there, right? Where, you know, there's audits, there's other assessments that happen, and these are just kind of ongoing monitors to say, how are things changing and tweaking? And so when I think of, you know, the frequency with which clients are monitoring, you know, the technology checks every day. The question is, how often do the people go in and look at that? And again, when, you know, I see the best practices, we align it to a business process. You know, one client looks at it weekly because they kind of do a suitability check on portfolios weekly. And so those two processes are linked. Another client has monthly product review meetings. So, you know, shelf monitor and the significant changes are kind of the prep for those product review meetings. And so, you know, connecting that in, it's, you know, the monitoring is about raising the bar and improving the process and bringing more intelligence to that, rather than a thing that lives kind of in isolation. The one thing I'll just mention on the side that I'm just seeing as I think a pleasant outcome of this, or byproduct, is because this monitoring obligation is universal. I think the quality of our data is going to improve, of the industry data, because providers all rely on that. And when someone who's monitoring, everyone, notices significant changes that may be an error or don't make sense, everyone notices, from the supplier of the data to the reseller of that to the consumer. And we've already seen, you know, and Richard and Justitia, you've been great partners in helping us work with data providers to just raise the bar on the quality of the data coming through.
Dave, Richard, Justitia, Nancy, thank you. I think we all have our PhDs on the dealer KYP requirements at this point. Let's now zoom down to the individual advisors front. But before we do that, let me just invite our audience to ask questions, engage us by way of the chat function. We have allocated plenty of time to tackle them. So speaking of the advisor's responsibility to understand their products a little bit better and actually assess a reasonable range of alternatives. Nancy, maybe I can start with you. What's the tone on the industry? We saw what the data suggested. Are firms making the necessary changes to adopt these requirements?
Right. So, just going back a little bit, there's now a requirement, right, as we know, for registrants as part of their suitability obligation to assess a reasonable range of alternative actions that are available to the registered individual through the firm at the time that they make a determination. So that's the principle. But, I think I may have said this before, KYP, as we know, is not a net new process, right? So yes, there is this enhanced suitability obligation to assess against reasonable alternatives, but the concept of know your product is not net new. So I think, many individuals were already comparing securities to other alternatives, right? So for example, I don't think you would have an individual recommending XYZ mutual fund blindly to their client without comparing it to the other options that they may have had. But I think that the biggest challenge is that firms are now having to keep records that they did this analysis and the analysis that they actually did. And that they did consider other options when making the decision to pick one stock over another. And that's where firms have had to take really big steps, I think, and to make sure that their IAs are actually equipped with the tools to satisfy their record-keeping requirements. And this could be, it just depends on the firm's business model, right? It could simply be using your existing note-taking software to document the alternatives you considered. Or you may use one of the options such as the InvestorCOM platform or other technology platforms to help provide you with that list of alternatives, which would help you evidence that review. Whichever approach that a firm takes, I think it's just important that you put in a process and actually follow that process. I think testing your processes is also important to make sure that the registered individuals are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? So overall, I think, again, it depends on the different approach or the different business model that you have, but there are different ways of tackling the requirement.
That mute button finally got me. Richard, let me focus the conversation back to sort of from a practical perspective. Can you touch on sort of the approaches you've taken on this particular advisor-specific responsibilities at your firm?
Yeah, I can. I just want to touch on something Nancy said. Absolutely agree. KYP is not net new. What is new is now that there is, with the implementation of the CFRs, there's an explicit KYP requirement for advisors more so than dealers to follow. We did some research for a KYP presentation. I think we delivered it back in 2018. And at the time, even without an explicit KYP standard for advisors to follow, if you look at complaints that had come into the MFDA and to IROC, there had still been a handful of investigations with respect to KYP by both regulators upon advisors, just making sure or looking at advisors not fulfilling their KYP responsibilities. So that was happening without the implementation of an explicit KYP standard. So with the implementation of this explicit KYP standard, we know that the number of investigations around KYP or the lack of it is only going to increase, which makes the dealer's responsibility to the advisors even more paramount. Dave, I wasn't trying to steal your thunder when I mentioned all the changes, thousands of changes that occur every month with respect to changes in data points like MER, or even a word within a fund's investment strategy. Because even if a word changes, the InvestorCOM tool will actually capture it, which I think is pretty interesting. What I was trying to do is really just emphasize the importance of the data. I think in the past, a lot has been with respect to satisfying a KYP requirement has been very qualitative in nature. I think with the creation of an explicit KYP requirement is, KYP moves more from a qualitative approach to a quantitative approach, where advisors as well as dealers are going to have an intimate knowledge of the data that really forms the central thesis for a product recommendation. And those data points can be things like MER, it can be Sharpe ratio, which I think is becoming available in the next month or so. Certainly performance, as well as qualitative features like how long has the manager been associated with the strategy. So from our standpoint, working with advisors with respect to KYP really comes down to two functions. It's education and it's consultation. And we've been talking to advisors since 2018 about the CFRs. We've looked at how the regulators have approached KYP from an advisor perspective prior to that. And as I mentioned, even without the implementation of an explicit KYP standard, they were still investigating advisors for not satisfying their KYP obligations. With that explicit standard, it's only going to increase. So, from 2018, we've shared the consultation papers that we've written to the CSA when we've commented on 31-103. In 2021, we absolutely stepped up our game, as did the industry. We wrote a handful of white papers, hosted the same amount of webinars on things like conflicts, on suitability, as well as KYP. I think I personally wrote about 5,000 words over the summer, but we also recognize this is not a one and done process. KYP is only going to become more paramount, so is suitability. And part of what a dealer has to do is continue to not only assess their product shelf, but educate and provide training to advisors, as well as internal staff for that matter, on the products that we approve for our product shelf and make available for advisors to use with their clients. You guys know that we implemented InvestorCOM's peer comparison solution last year. We did so because we thought it was easy to use. We knew what the source of the data, where the source of the data was coming from. We've been using that data for a long time, so we already had that intimate knowledge of that data. And we liked the way it was being aggregated. I can tell you, one of the things that we were worried about was that the peer comparisons of products that advisors were looking at might have initially be too big. So we thought we were going to try, and we initially took the approach of trying to narrow that down. So we had initially 6 matching criteria, and our advisors, to their credit, basically said, look, you know what? We're not getting the peer comparisons we want. We're not getting as many as we want. So as a result of that feedback, we changed our approach a little bit. So instead of using 6 matching criteria, we actually narrowed it down to 4. That had the impact of increasing the number of peer comparisons that advisors can make. So, this is not a one-way street. If you're really going to be successful from a dealer standpoint in implementing KYP or any component of the CFRs, you really have to listen to the end user, which in this case is advisors. And that's the key to the whole strategy. The whole industry, dealers, third-party vendors like InvestorCOM, subject matter experts like Nancy. We just have to continue to communicate in order to provide that platform for everyone to benefit from.
Amazing insights. Oh, why am I echoing? Am I echoing for everybody? No. Okay. Mr. Rizi, thank you for that. That's fantastic. And I can see certainly questions are trickling in, and we've got T-minus 10 minutes. So let me fast forward the conversation a little bit more, and sort of just so we hit off our specific agenda items that we set out in the beginning. And let's zoom down to a post-CFR regime, regulatory examinations, and what folks can expect. We've heard about it a little bit throughout today's discussion. Nancy, I'm wondering, with the fact that we're now 2 months into the CFR regime, what would you say to firms or your clients who are preparing for the examinations?
Yeah, so I think, listen, regulators are cognizant of the fact that firms did have a lot of changes to make to their operations, to their policies, processes. And so I think that for the next little while, regulators will be reasonable in their expectations and are really going to be looking more for good faith efforts to comply, right? So I don't think anyone's going to be expecting absolute perfection at this point. I think they're probably going to spend the next little while assessing just how firms and registered individuals have implemented the CFRs and whether that implementation is in fact in line with what they had expected to be the results of these rules. And so from what I understand, regulators have already started testing for compliance with the conflict of interest requirements. And so sweeps are currently underway throughout various jurisdictions in Canada. And, what I have heard is that there's going to be a sweep conducted on a sizable number of firms. So, and after they conduct this sweep, of course, that's when the guidance that I was alluding to earlier is going to come out. So we'll have a better understanding once that guidance note comes out of, whether the approaches or the decisions we've made are in line with, with what the regulators were expecting. And, we'll see some best practices come out, and we may need to refine or revise our processes, which is expected. And so another thing I've heard is that there is going to be another FAQ coming out, so watch out for that. The regulators have been quite helpful, I think, with the CFRs. We've seen, I don't think I've ever seen so many FAQs come out for a rule, which is fantastic because you're seeing a lot of cooperation and a genuine effort to help the industry understand the rules and implement them better. And of course, don't forget, right, there's also CFR phase 2. You'll recall that when October came out and these final rules were published, there were some topics that were parked, right? So there was the referral arrangements. There was supposed to be a more, detailed rule about it, which was not the same. So I think you'll see more on referrals. You'll see more on proficiencies and titles. So CFR is here to stay. And I think we'll just be fine-tuning our processes for the next little while until we've come to the industry standard that we all believe in, and the regulatory standard will be established as well.
Thanks for sharing that insight. Certainly, I can see questions popping up here, and please, folks, ask any questions that may come to mind around sweeps and what the market can expect. So, Nancy, thank you for sharing that. Now, let me just jump to Richard and Justitia. I'll ask you first, Richard. What are the key contributors to the success of this CFR journey project, specifically as it pertains to KYP? Maybe if you have any insights on sharing that.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. I think we're successful really for 3 reasons. We started early. We very quickly realized the importance that the CFRs were going to have on our business as well as on advisors' practices. And staying true to who I am, I think success was really due to the due diligence that we put into the project, which is very similar to doing a good product review.
Thanks for sharing that. Justitia, any final sort of comments on the success of your project?
No, yeah, appreciate the question. I feel like I touched upon a couple of things. Like Richard said, it's like in life in general, it's always good to start these types of things early, especially when you have a deadline that is not flexible. Oftentimes in organizations, if budgets change, if circumstances change, there's some flexibility. Compliance does not have that, benefit, does not have that luxury. So assuming you can start early, that sets you up for success. But I think some things I alluded to just in terms of really trying to build a culture that embraces digitization, because starting early is important, but embracing digitization can compress timeframes so you can get some of that time back, and has a commitment to, again, just agile delivery. I know it is a buzzword, but to really think of agile not as technology methodology, it is cultural philosophy. You have to be thinking this way because the regulations are going to be becoming increasingly dense, complex, because it's not just the financial landscape that's starting to change, but it's the technology one. Once, personal data portability, all that stuff, it's all going to come to a head. It's all starting to intertwine already. We see it happening south of the border. You see it happening in Europe. It's going to happen in Canada. One of the things that defines the Canadian landscape is it's kind of represented by, a smaller number of major players. So they're going to have similar issues. So I think the way Canada chooses to kind of take this on in the coming years is going to be really interesting. A lot of the simple things we all know, like having very clear and visible support. One thing we really benefited from, because sometimes regulatory work can kind of be the work that people just do because they have to. But to really have a vision to know that this isn't just something that you have to do. This could be an opportunity to move things ahead further. What do I mean? I'll link it to one thing we talked about earlier about partnerships. Now, we're not just talking about third-party vendors like InvestorCOM, but within your organizations. One thing that I found was so interesting is when we were looking at the shelf monitor and the peer compare and some of the different tools that InvestorCOM offers, we immediately started to see things. Dave mentioned things like the materiality index, the peer rating. And it wasn't just, this helps us ensure that the products that we have on our shelf and recommend to our customers are appropriate and meet the regulatory requirements. I, can, not so much in COVID, but just knock on the door of a colleague and be like, hey, would the marketing team or the product development team be interested to know a quantitative number that compared our products to our competitors' products? Now you're starting to build partnerships and alliances within your organizations. You talk about business process optimization. You talk about, rationalizing business processes. You talk about user experience. You talk about product development and strategy teams. There is common ground here. And I think that is a really interesting concept and interesting space to think about, to not just be successful now, Param, but really set you up for success going further. One thing I would really just challenge some people to really think deeply about is you may have partners and allies that you don't even know yet if you embrace this as enterprise broader digital transformation. I know we're at time, Param, so I'll just end it there.
Those are fantastic words to bring our conversation to an end. I want to personally thank you, Nancy, Justitia, Richard, and Dave Carprise for sharing your respective voices throughout today's conversation. We invite everyone to continue to stay engaged with us. We're going to follow up with everyone on the call today with some content that you may find useful. And please let us know what you think. We plan to engage with you on a future topic as well. And thank you all for your attendance and time today. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, Parm.
Thanks, everyone.